Hello, people. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Let's go first to another Chris O Wiki thread. Always good for some great content. We're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, medical care. Quote, the most you can get is a slight injury. If you get something more, that's it. You will die, says a Russian military paramedic. His comments highlight the terrible state of medical care in the Russian army, which is causing untold tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths. The head of the Kalashnikov Center for Tactical Medicine, Artem Katulin, says that more than half of the Russian soldiers who have died in Ukraine lost their lives because of improperly provided medical care, with a third of amputations due to improper tourniquet application. Talked lots before about the ratio between killed in action and wounded in action, and for the Russians, it is far closer than they would like. So you might normally have, I don't know, a 1 to 3 ratio, 1 to 4 ratio. So for every one soldier who dies, you've got 3 or 4 wounded. With the Russians, it's some of the figures are 1 to 1 in certain contexts. Some are, some I've seen recently are 1 to 2, which means that there aren't so many injured. Why aren't there so many injured? Because the injuries end up being killed in action because they're dying from their injuries where they normally wouldn't, and they certainly shouldn't. They are not getting that critical care soon enough, that golden hour to getting medical care within an hour of being injured. And then you've got the platinum 5 minutes as well, which is the 5 minutes after being injured. Are you getting the bleeding staunched and tourniquet applied correctly, so on and so forth. So to return to Chris O, Important Stories has interviewed Important Stories is the name of this project or article, has interviewed a Russian army paramedic about the poor training and antiquated equipment, which has cost many soldiers their lives. Medical training, he says, is minimal, even for medics. In 10 years as a paramedic, he only received 4 training sessions. Training is even more basic for ordinary soldiers. Quote, twice a year, the army has a class where the paramedic shows us how to put a splint on, more of that in a minute, and how to put bandages on. And in the last class I attended, the paramedic did the bandage wrong. That is, the man himself doesn't know how to do it and teaches others incorrectly. He's not the only medic to have complained about the lack of training. I've previously highlighted the account of Russian Army Dr. Pavel Zelenkov, who has spoken of the fake training he did with his unit, which consisted only of posing for photo reports. Quote, all medicine was reduced to window dressing. Before a field trip, i.e. an exercise, you get dressed up for a masquerade, you get photographed, a report is sent to command, everyone returns to their places. This feeds into the idea of Veranio, or Veranio feeds into this. So Perun did a really good video on this. Go and check out Perun's channel if you haven't already. Where have you been? Perun's video on Veranio is really enlightening, giving you a sense of how BS goes up the command. You get someone giving a report here, you got a report of training. This is the training we've done here, the photos we got, and you're giving this report over to your superior. Now, you know that this report is BS. You also know that your superior knows that that report is BS, and your superior knows that you know it's BS, and your superior knows that you know that he knows it's BS. And so you go through this merry dance of BS where you're handing over reports, everyone knows it's BS, but they sign it off and it goes up the command, and the person at the top of the command is happy because on paper, everything's awesome. Everything's awesome. I was going to break into song there. Don't make me do that. So you had this situation in the Russian army where you've got a huge on paper, you've got a huge amount of equipment, you've got a huge amount of really well-trained soldiers, you've got a huge amount of ammunition, you've got a huge amount. Turns out you have a war, you got none of that stuff, or what you do have is an incredibly poor state, including the soldiers and the training of those soldiers, and in this case medics. So it's that kind of BS delivery system is an endemic problem in the Russian armed forces, and probably throughout government, I imagine. And we'll kind of link this to a corruption scandal that is developing in Russia. So Medical equipment is notoriously bad. As Important Stories interviewee notes, quote, what we were issued with on the front line was an ancient Soviet PPI, individual wound dressing bag, although the Soviet one was still good, but the Russian one was shite, and an Esmar tourniquet. Quote, that's some rubbery red shite that's been lying in talcum powder for 500 years. They gave them to the soldiers and one tube of Promedol. Are you effing serious? Or now a lot of people have got their own effing first aid kits, but nobody knows how to use them. For instance, there's these rubbish domestic, I'm not swearing, but there are swear words here. There are these rubbish domestic hemostatics, blood thinners for burn injuries. And in addition to having to treat the wound itself, you then have to treat the burn. Just using the wrong pressure dressing can cause a lot of blood loss or dirt to get in, which can lead to infection and putrefaction. He says that the best medical equipment he has used is Israeli and American, which is, quote, very cool but very expensive. Imported disposable kits to stop arterial bleeding cost as much as 52,000 rubles, $645. Quote, no one in the army buys them and no one knows how to use them. His own American made medical kit, quote, cost 110,000 rubles, that's $1,360. Nobody gave me that money. It was bought out of my own money and my boys contributed. That is, all the normal medicine in the units is collected by people themselves. No one gives anything away. Most Russian medics appear to be far less well equipped. When paratrooper Pavel Filatiev was evacuated from the front line near Mykolaiv in April 2022, his medic asked him to report that, quote, he doesn't have any syringes and painkillers. There's not even that on the front line. When Dr. Zelenkov arrived at his post, he had a similar experience. Quote, in terms of medical equipment, there was practically nothing there. You only administer first aid and get sent on your way, so there was nothing in line with what the medical unit was initially designed for. Rather than learning from the army, Important Stories medic had to learn from his own doctor friends and other combat medics before teaching his comrades how to perform essential treatments. However, Russian law prohibits him from carrying out life-saving interventions. So he's having to teach himself or learn by osmosis, learn by people around him, rather than being some kind of training system that the army has in place. Quote, I have the right to provide first aid to a soldier, but if, for example, I understand that an artery has been severed, I can't just take a scalpel, cut it, clamp the artery, fix it, tie it up, and prepare a person for immobilization. I'm not allowed by law to do that. If I do that, they will take him to surgery and write a complaint and put me in jail for having performed a surgical intervention without proper authorization. He says that this has actually happened to other medics. He says that soldiers need to learn to help themselves as they are good as dead if they sustain anything more than a light injury. He advises his comrades, you will die. No one will help you. No one will come. No one will do anything if you can't do it yourself. Nobody gives an F about the soldier. Nobody will do anything about him. That's the main problem with all these traumas. A lot of people die not because they get killed, but because they can't get proper medical care. And this talks to the idea that the Ukrainians, and this sounds like, oh, very nice, Ukrainian propaganda narrative, but it seems to be eminently true that the Ukrainians value the lives of their soldiers way more than the Russians value the lives of theirs. And that probably isn't helped by the fact that they are recruiting a whole load of convicts and they necessarily, or not necessarily, but in the case of these generals or commanders or whatever, see less value in these soldiers because they're convicts or just untrained, mobilized people rather than soldiers that contracted soldiers that they've gone through training with and have that relationship with. They're just, they're not valuing these soldiers as human beings, and they just don't get the care that you would think they deserve. So there's a big difference, I think, between the two armies. The medic calls for Russian soldiers to be given proper first aid training as a matter of routine. Quote, what happens when this soldier gets his leg blown off? He will simply die of fright if he is still conscious because he doesn't know what to do with it. It is better to take small numbers, trained fighters who know what they have to do and how to do it, not a stupid herd who just say, forward to the Tsar and to the fatherland. They're dressing them up like they're on their last journey. They don't even give them guns everywhere. Soon it'll be like in Soviet times. One has a rifle, the other has ammunition. He also dismisses claims that Russian troops are using drugs to help them fight. Quote, we tried such tests in practice. We made cocktails. You can last 2 to 3 days, but then you just turn into a vegetable and have to be dug out. Need vitamins, sleep, normal food. In short, recovery is very long. The more so when you're drugged up, you'll die quicker because the blood pumps faster, so the blood loss will be greater. Yes, there are junkies everywhere. Someone does take drugs just because he's scared, but not to be a super duper berserker. Interesting. Um, so that is what Chris Owicki has to say. And actually, this reminds me. No, let's go to this one first because it's completely relevant. So, medical support of the Russian Second Army of the World looks very poor. So here we have a situation of a Russian soldier obviously having. He has an injured leg there, and it's been probably a broken leg. There's a splint that's been made from his Kalashnikov. That's the extent of, or whatever gun that is. That's the extent of the Russian medical care. So it's not great, is it? And then along that kind of line, didn't want to do two big Chris Owicki threads in a row. It's a bit heavy for you listening, I guess, but it kind of links in with the idea that there's corruption everywhere. It's just stuff isn't happening as it should, and there is good reason there's good justification for Russia being at the very near the bottom of the transparency index of international corruption. A major corruption scandal is reported to be unfolding in the Russian Ministry of Defense that implicates several generals and ministers concerning the hugely expensive concentration of Russia's National Defense Control Center, NDCC, in 2014. The VCHK OGPU Telegram channel, he refers to that quite a lot, reports that an embezzlement investigation concerning the installation of the software for ballistic missiles and cruise missile detection radars has spawned another major investigation relating to corruption in the construction of the NDCC. The lavishly designed NDCC, located in central Moscow, is the supreme command and control center of the MOD and the Russian armed forces. Its purpose is to provide centralized control of the armed forces. Forces and coordinate military operations. It was opened in 2014 after huge cost overruns. It reportedly cost over 40 billion rubles, that's $500 million, and that Telegram channel says was spent on beautiful sofas, armchairs, televisions, and computers for fabulous money, bought at several times higher than the market value. The sprawling case reportedly began when the Military Department of Investigation of the Strategic Missile Forces uncovered an incident of petty bribery. An employee of RTI Systems was arrested for taking a bribe to employ a person in the company's military acceptance office. He struck a plea deal under which he agreed to talk about other crimes in exchange for a suspended sentence. As a result, he implicated Colonel Murchikov, the MOD's military representative in RTI Systems. The company is a leading supplier of radar and comms systems. The colonel was, quote, charged with the same episode of bribery for employment as well as two other episodes of bribery for general patronage and in the form of an apartment, and was also accused of machinations in installing software on radar complexes. Marchikov was reportedly bribed with a gift of an apartment by Sergei Datsko, the head of the Dubnensky machine building plant, DMZ, which develops and produces UAVs and the Moskit KH-22 and KH-55 cruise missiles. The bribe is said to have been in exchange for Marchikov overlooking corruption in the MOD. Marchikov was in turn granted leniency in investigations seeking to find out who was involved in corruption at more senior levels. He reportedly gave testimony implicating Major General Lobuzko, whom the Telegraph channel describes as, quote, one of the fathers of the Voronezh SPSV radar designed to detect ballistic and cruise missiles. And that's that picture you've seen a couple of times. I've been talking about that over the last week or two. Lobuzko was the former division commander of the 3rd Independent Air Defense Army. He moved to RTI in 2000 after his retirement from the armed forces and worked for the company until 2019 as a senior manager in Sistema's Defense Division. While employed by RTI, he oversaw the construction of the NDCC. The Moscow Garrison Court has reportedly placed him under arrest. If convicted, the 68-year-old general faces a lengthy prison sentence. The case may not end there. A Telegram source believes that Lobuzko will also be forced to make a deal with the investigation, quote, which could So that is the quote, which could lead to senior MOD leadership. The channel speculates that he could implicate, among others, Major General Oleg Stepanov, head of the MOD's Department of Military Representation, and former Deputy Minister of Defense Mikhail Mizintsev, who formerly headed the NDCC. The scandal may potentially reach as far as Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu himself. He created the NDC and is known for his lavish spending on luxury properties, such as the Asian-style dacha near Moscow. When you've got MOD personnel on MOD, or what should be MOD wages, salaries, buying lavish properties, you know something is happening. You know corruption is taking place. When Putin is the richest man in the world, which he supposedly is, yes, it's officially Elon Musk or whoever, but in reality, given that all his riches are hidden away, in reality, it's almost certainly Putin, having built palaces near the Black Sea, so on and so forth. When these people have that much money, where's Putin got that money from? Well, from corruption within the Russian government. It's just insanely corrupt society. Which brings me on to a comment by the awesome Jan Narkovich, who says, I have friends who will message me, see how corrupt Ukraine is? So I reply, so Russia should be allowed to rape their women, steal their children, kill civilians, and destroy their cities? I never receive a reply message. The idea that Ukraine is a corrupt one, I know there's a bit of whataboutery here, but it's those in glass houses don't throw stones. Don't accuse Ukraine of being corrupt when they are actually successfully arresting people, trying to change that. They have to change that in order to gain accession to the EU, to get on board with NATO, to get the IMF giving them money. It's not only did they want to do that anyway, Zelensky set out to do that when he took his post, but actually they absolutely have to do that in order to kind of secure their existential future. But Russia, on the other hand, is incredibly corrupt to the tune of bazillions. It's those who are attacking Ukraine for their corruption need to just kind of have a look in the mirror if they are Russians, if they're pro-Russian. What are you doing? Because you're siding with Russia on account of Ukraine's corruption, yet Russia has far greater corruption, and on the transparency index is further down than Ukraine, and Ukraine is improving. And you think because Ukraine has corruption, that entitles Russia to go and do what it's doing? No, not at all. So yeah, thanks for that insight there, Jan. Right, let's talk about politics. Now, this is where I'm going to probably annoy 50% of my American viewers. Sorry about that. I shouldn't annoy you, because what I'm doing is presenting data and presenting fairly accepted political psychology as well. So don't shoot the messenger. But this is really interesting in trying to understand why there is a difference in America as to how people view the Ukraine-Russia war. So this came out on the 10th of May, and I've been holding off on talking about this because I didn't, when I mentioned Musk and this in the same kind of video, people get just annoyed and unsubscribe and whatever. So, playing a little bit careful. But Americans hold positive feelings toward NATO and Ukraine, and they see Russia as an enemy. So that's the overall findings here, which is good stuff. Growing share of Republicans say US should pay less attention to the problems overseas and focus on concerns at home. This is a really common Republican viewpoint. And actually, we can see this as a really common conservative, small c conservative viewpoint, because actually you'll find that played out around lots of different nations. Now, a bit of political psychology before we go on, because it might give you a little bit of understanding. So looking at the work of people like Jonathan Haidt and others, forget the green one here, because this is just someone's personal score line. But in terms of political psychology and morality, the work they've done is to look at initially 5, but they split it into 6 different areas of how you can view morality. So the 5 were initially the 5 psychological foundations of morality were harm or care, fairness or reciprocity, in-group or loyalty. So the in-group is people who are like you, the out-group are people who are outside your in-group. So it's us and them. So in-group or loyalty, authority or respect, purity and sanctity. and that kind of got adapted. Another one was added. You can see here actually in this piece how you might understand some of those. So if you want to pause and just look over that table, please feel free to do so. That gives you an understanding of the adaptive challenges, so how these might come about with evolution, original triggers, current triggers, so how we get triggered with these things now compared to how we might have got triggered with that, characteristic emotions associated with that, and relevant virtues. So you have care and harm, fairness and cheating, authority and subversion, loyalty and betrayal. There's slightly different names as they originally were. Sanctity and degradation, and liberty and oppression is one that has been added. So those are your six different areas. I could bore you with going into the details of each of these, but you'll see things like purity, which is sanctity and degradation, might be see that might be a lot to do with physiological stuff, but also there's elements of religion as well that's closely tied to that, so on and so forth. Loads of different ideas here. But if we go back to look at that little chart, so care, fairness, loyalty, authority, purity, and liberty. And it turns out that broadly speaking, conservatives are they value all of those things sort of equally, but there's maybe a little bit more concentration on authority, a little bit more on liberty, sort of personal liberty, which is interesting because there's a little bit of tension there. And things like, loyalty and purity are still equally important to them. But liberals, so if you look at the blue column, they don't find purity, authority, and loyalty are less important to liberals. Liberty is important, but fairness and care are your big ones. So that's about fairness in the world and care. So this source gives a little bit of explanation, just to pick one. The fairness cheating one talks about how today the left demonstrates the fairness cheating foundation when discussing social justice. Think of debates about economic inequality. I mean, I'm always banging on about that, right? In which Democrats argue that the wealthy are, quote, not paying their fair share. The right demonstrates the fairness cheating foundation when it argues that the government takes money from hardworking Americans through taxes and gives it to lazy people on welfare and unemployment, that kind of idea, and illegal immigrants through healthcare and education. When speaking about fairness, liberals are generally alluding to equality, while for me, that's equality of opportunity, while conservatives are generally alluding to proportionality, hence the disconnect. At least in part, liberals still rely more on the fairness foundation than conservatives, as you can see from the chart. And I know I'm a liberal, and actually that's for me. Like, I don't care about loyalty particularly. Like, I'm over that now. Authority, no. Purity, absolutely not. Purity and tradition. So sometimes this is explained as tradition as well. So I don't care about tradition particularly. Sometimes it's quite nice, but it doesn't drive me. Whereas I know so I look at my parents or my partner's parents who are deeply conservative, and they are really big into pomp and ceremony and wonderful tradition of, talk about the coronation, stuff like that. I go along, and we got tea and cakes, brilliant, I'm there. But I'm kind of ambivalent. Those things float their boats, but not my boat. I'm more interested in fairness for the world. And so this is where we get on to talking about what's called in-group and out-group psychology. In-group psychology is concerned for people like me, and that starts with you, and it goes on to your family, and it extends out and extends out. And it turns out that conservatives have much. I mean, literally, it's in the word conservative. You are conserving your care for those around you, and you're conserving your care for tradition. So new experience, openness to new experiences is something that liberals are supposedly, it's a much bigger thing on their kind of metrics. But in terms of conservatives, the in group is far more important. And so when you're going to give to charity, you look at American charities, and your conservative charities are about family and stuff to do with people like you. Whereas liberal charities are like refugee charities, where your in group is extended outwards and outwards and outwards until it's the whole world. In fact, the whole world is your in group. Like, the in group and out group, there isn't this separation between us and them. For liberals, and of course there's everyone in between, and I'm simplifying here, but for many liberals, the out group is part of your in group, and it's just we're just one big humanity. So you start looking at charities like that and think about what charities do you give to? Are you more likely to give to money to a charity that looks after refugees? No? Okay, well then where do you sit politically? And how does your political positioning, how does that accord with your psychology and your morality? And these are all really closely linked, and this is what Jonathan Haidt and others sought to sort of find out these connections between these things. So a liberal would be more interested in care and fairness, but actually for the conservative, it's not like they don't care about those things, but they appear to care fairly equally about stuff, with a few things being slightly more important. Whereas for the liberal, it's care and harm. So lack of harm. I don't want those people to be harmed. Doesn't matter who they are. I don't like harm, and I'm really big on care. Liberty, oppression, fairness. And cheating, things like that, are super important. And actually, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, and degradation. That's kind of purity. Those ideas. There's all those different words for these different categories, but those are just really not very important, or not nearly as important for liberals. And so once you understand that kind of psychology going on, and particularly the in-group out-group idea, so for conservatives, in-group's really important. For liberals, it's not that important. Then you start understanding this data, right? That's why I went into talking about that, because actually this data talks to those ideas. Right. So, in the midst of a major international conflict in Ukraine and an expansion of NATO in Europe, Americans have distinct opinions on the key players in the war. The majority of US adults have favorable views of Ukraine itself as well as NATO, and have confidence in Ukraine's leader, Zelensky. At the same time, few have positive opinions of Russia or confidence in its ruler, President Vladimir Putin, and a 64% majority view Russia as an enemy of the US rather than as a competitor or partner. Now, I still find this interesting, right? So when you look at the views on Russia, I'm not so interested in Ukraine and NATO here, but the views on Russia, you've got an overwhelming majority having it somewhat unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Russia. But you've still got 7% of people that view Russia favorably, 1% very favorably. Now, that may seem like a tiny minority, and it is. It is a small minority. But when you're thinking of 100 people in America that you might meet, 100 people today, I'm going to meet 100 people today, 7 of them are going to be broadly supportive of Russia. And that's quite interesting to me. When you think about it in that real world context, it makes you go, "Oh, okay, that's changes things a little bit." Anyway, this is some very fascinating data. So Americans, and especially Republicans, increasingly say that the US should focus on issues at home. And I've heard this so much. We should be spending money on building the wall, and all that money that's going from the US to Ukraine. And I've explained how that's the wrong way of looking at that anyway, but won't go down that rabbit hole again. But they say we should be spending that money on things at home. And now remember, it's about your in group. It's us, people like us. So the in group for Americans is broadly America, but actually you will see that shrink down to my state, my community, and you might look at America and say, actually, those people over there, like Democrats, don't represent, they're not in main group, so they're part of the out group. But they will start with America and then shrink down. So increasingly, Republicans say that the US should focus on issues at home, while Democrats say it's best for the US to be active in world affairs. And there's an element of in-group, out-group understanding there. So when we look at Republican or lean Republicans, so here we have when this is going back to 2020. So when Trump was in charge in 2019, 60% of people believed that we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. And interestingly, when Biden sort of was coming in charge there, then that seemed to dip. So then we see a dip in paying less attention to overseas. So the overseas became more important here. As you can see here, it raised its profile. And I don't know if that was to do with the talk in run up to the elections that would have taken place in November, where there would be more talk about what's going on abroad. And it's more in the limelight. But then after that, Biden in charge, Republicans started saying, no, we don't care about abroad. And then the war came along, and actually that maybe there's a little bit more concern for abroad. And then when the US started spending money on helping out Ukraine, assisting Ukraine, that figure then went up. It's like, no, we don't care about abroad. We care more about home, and we care less about abroad. But what's interesting is these lines are just completely switched for Democrat and lean Democrat. So you have, and it's quite stable as well. It's broadly stable, and then so we care. It's best for the future of our country to be active in world affairs. Starts off in the 60s, goes up to 65, and then drops a little, possibly around. Well, it seemed to drop before the war, and has stayed around the same for the war, which is at 60%. So it's fairly stable. I don't know that you can see too much about trend changes there, but it's certainly important that those lines are just the opposite kind of areas to what the Republicans are. So there's just a completely different worldview here, and I think that's fascinating, and it really does accord with your political positioning. I suppose that because that is a political stance, isn't it? What we're talking about is a political stance, so therefore you would expect it to be in line with political persuasion. And of course, that then sort of affects the national landscape, if you like. So, if we have a little discussion about this, so over the past few years, there have also been shifts in how Americans viewed their place in the world. A majority, 55%, say the US should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems at home, compared with 43% who say it's best for the future of the country to be active in world affairs. Now, what I've said before is the US is like the center of world affairs. It's like the hegemony, the supreme power in the world, and all the benefits that obtains are probably things that US citizens don't really realize. They don't really make the connection between having that position in the world and having a really high GDP and well-functioning economy. But of course, that's super important. So that's your return on investment, and the investment is in geopolitics around the world. That's your investment, and you get your return on investment in terms of all the trade deals and all the economic shenanigans that takes place around the world that benefit the US. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. But of course, there's also several things going on. So there might be things back in the US that are problematic. So the wealth distribution, the wealth inequality, the income inequality is pretty terrible in the States. When you compare it to G20 countries, you've got a really big difference between rich and poor. So things aren't operating well, but that's domestic politics. So you can still do all this great stuff or important stuff, or some people say it's not great stuff, abroad, right? You can still do all that abroad and sort all those things out at home. It's not like a zero-sum game. Like, we can only sort this stuff out at home if we stop doing stuff abroad. No, we just need to change our domestic politics around to sort these things out at home and still do the stuff abroad. So it's not an either or, but both and. But that's not necessarily how people perceive it. So you get a lot of people saying, we need to sort this stuff out here, so we need to stop spending money on Ukraine. And but that is just not the case. So what it discusses here is that it's the shift from 2021. So before the war, you had 50% of people being thinking that the US should pay less attention to problems overseas, and now that's 55. So it's a 5% shift. People are reacting against the war, it seems, to say we need to concentrate more on stuff going on at home. As is typical of American public opinion, there are partisan divides on many of the international issues surveyed. Democrats and independents who lean toward the Democratic Party are on balance more favorable toward Ukraine, NATO, and key European leaders. Republicans and independents who lean toward the Republican Party are more likely to want to pay attention to domestic issues rather than be active in foreign affairs, and are more inclined to say the US should follow its own interests. There are also slight partisan differences in attitudes toward Putin, with Republicans marginally less negative than Democrats toward Russia's leader, and Republicans are almost equally divided in their views toward NATO, Ukraine, and Zelensky. So other key findings include Democrats, those who with more education, and people who say the US should consider the interests of other countries, all give more support to NATO alliance, with about half, 49% of Republicans have a positive view of NATO, down from 55% in the weeks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So since this war, in the length that this war has been taking place, a year, Republicans have had an increasing dissatisfaction with NATO, which is kind of odd. With NATO doing their job, and they are more active and more successful than they have been in living memory. And yet, for some reason, the Republican voters have shifted somewhat their views on NATO to a more negative point. Support for Ukraine follows a similar pattern, with older American Democrats, especially liberal Democrats, and those who think it's best for the US to be active in world affairs, having more positive views of the country. Attitudes toward Russia remain negative. The majority of Americans have very unfavorable opinions of Russia. That's 62%. That 64% of people say Russia is an enemy, and 71% have no confidence at all in Putin. Now, that seems very high, and it says, attitudes towards Russia remain very negative, but actually, compared to many European nations, that is not as high as European nations, especially given that there's a war going on and, Russia enemy number one. Zelensky gets higher praise from older Americans and those with more education and Democrats, and about 9 in 10 Americans have heard of the Ukrainian leader. Which is very different from the amount who've heard of Macron, I think, and Scholz. Scholz, I think, only gets 25%. People have heard of Olaf Scholz, the German leader, and a little bit more about Macron. Those who say the US should be active in world affairs are more positively inclined towards Macron, Scholz, and Zelensky. The share of Republicans saying the US should focus on problems at home rather than paying attention to issues overseas has increased 6 percentage points since last year. And the share saying this is now 17 points higher than it was in September 2019 during the Trump administration. Democrats are 8 percentage points more likely than since 2020 to say the US should follow its own interests in international affairs, even if allies disagree. So that's an interesting little nuance there. So the US should be headstrong, even if allies say they shouldn't. So on and so forth. I mean, there's so much in here. I could go on and on. An awful lot of great data. I love the Pew Research Center. It does such interesting data analyses, collection and analyses. But I'm sure there's more to come out from this once I give it a bit more of an in-depth look and look at some of the how to slice and dice that data. Republicans overwhelmingly say that US should focus on domestic issues, while Democrats think it's best for the US to be active in world affairs. And you can see the difference in ages. So the Republican lean Republican, Democrat lean Democrat, but also young people are less inclined to think about and I guess that's understandable. Young people aren't going to be so knowledgeable about the world. They're younger, they haven't experienced the world, they don't know so much about global politics, so they're going to be less caring about that. They're going to be caring about more immediate things to them. So it's only as you get older you understand the importance of geopolitics, so on and so forth. I only have to look at my own data for viewership of this channel to understand that that's broadly borne out with myself as well. So you can see all the ways to cut this up. Hopefully that was of some use. Although there's lots more to talk about, I had in line to talk about the difference between PAC-2 and PAC-3 Patriot air defense missile system, but that'll wait till tomorrow. Hopefully that's of use. I was trying not to give my own political opinions. This is just literally what the data is showing and what political psychologists have found. But remember that those are generalized, and there'll be an awful lot of people. In fact, most people here, those who are Republicans, will be disagreeing with that generalized Republican conclusion, because you are really interested in this war and in the geopolitics and the international politics concerned with the war in Ukraine. And so for you guys, this doesn't speak to you so much. But in general, remember this is a generalized statistical conclusion. I find it interesting, and it does fit in line with what I understand of moral and political psychology. Anyway, take care. I really appreciate you being here with me. Please like, subscribe, and share. And I will speak to you again soon.